Thank you very much. Thank you in particular to Professor Gromersall, who invited me and arranged this talk as well as the 4 that I gave earlier today. So I don't know, it's not costing you much, but you're getting your money's worth. This has really been delightful. It's a very lovely campus. I'm very happy to be here. I'm extremely honored that you went to the trouble of arranging to have Garrison Keillor serve as my warm-up act. That was especially nice as well. So Professor Gromersall, I think, maybe discovered what I'm doing in Kansas City just by stumbling across a blog that I started about 2.5 years ago in the wake of the financial crisis and the ensuing economic meltdown. And a number of my colleagues and I got together and we said we should do something to try to have a voice in this. Because so much of what academics do is spend their time writing journal articles that are read by, well, the 2 people who review them for publication and maybe 2 or 3 others. So we decided that this new medium might offer us a chance to get into the debate in a new way and maybe have some kind of a positive influence. So we've been running the blog now for about 2.5 years, and it has been really, really successful. The things that we publish are very topical. They're aimed at a lay person most of the time, so that you don't have to be an economist to read the kinds of things that we're writing about, but we're writing about the problems that the economy continues to face. The financial system, housing markets, jobs, Social Security, policy reform, and so forth. So maybe if you're interested, you might want to take a look. It's called New Economic Perspectives. If you Google that, you will very easily find a link to the website. So the title of the talk that Professor Gromersall assigned to me is Why You and I Can't Spend More Than We Make, but the government can and probably should. Okay, so this clearly flies in the face of conventional wisdom. Everything that we hear about today is how the federal government needs to get its fiscal house in order. How, if the private sector tightens its belt, surely the public sector ought to do likewise. Fiscal responsibility. At this point, there is no alternative. Right? We look around, what do we see? Debt crises in other parts of the world. What if we're next? That's the fear. We better start now. The president has gone on television early on in his administration, and he was asked, what's the fiscal state of the U.S.? And he said, we're broke. Those are his words. We're broke. Right? He then ended up with an economy that was deeply in recession. The financial crisis was much more severe than people anticipated. Economists underestimated the extent, the severity of the crisis. The stimulus package that was passed early in the first part of his administration was too small for the job at hand, and the cries began. It didn't work. It didn't work. All you did was drive up the deficit, drive up the debt, burden our grandchildren, leave us all drowning in debt. I mean, we've all heard this, right? This is part of the narrative. This was a policy mistake. This is what we're told. How did the president respond? Basically, in a sense, by agreeing. Well, it saved jobs, right? That was the brilliance behind his initial pledge. He never overpromised. He was very clever. He said, if this legislation is passed, it will create or save 2.3 million jobs. Can anybody here prove it didn't? No, you can't. Because you can't go back in time and take away the stimulus and push the play button and see how things would have unfolded in its absence. You don't know how many jobs were saved. None of us do. But it was never a very bold promise to begin with, to pledge to create or save 2.3 trillion jobs when the economy was hemorrhaging 600, 700,000 jobs a month in the early part of the crisis. Was never a very bold economic plan, but it's the one he thought he could get through, $787 billion. And now the finger pointing begins because it didn't do more to help the economy. And the president says, things would have been worse without it, but I agree with you, we must get our deficit and debt under control. So what does he do? He pledges to cut the deficit in half by the end of his first term. As soon as he did that, I knew that things would not improve significantly. He just pulled the rug out from under the only policy tool he had to bring about an economic recovery. And he said he wouldn't use it. I'll cut the deficit in half by the end of my first term. Now we have a super committee. And what do they want to do? Go big. Go big. That's Obama. He's the biggest cheerleader for the super committee. Go big. Go big. Right? Go big. What does that mean? Give me a big plan to help the economy. No, it means give me a big deficit-cutting program so that I can keep my pledge, so that my opponent doesn't show footage of me promising to cut the deficit in half, and then not making good on that promise. Go big. Bring me trillions in cuts. Why? There is no alternative. We're broke. This is what he says. So the Democrats and the Republicans are fighting over how to cut the deficit. One side says, raise taxes. The other side says, cut spending. Right? It's a sad state of affairs. We see fiscal austerity being implemented across Europe. How is it working? It's not. The deficits are getting bigger. Unemployment is getting worse. Social conditions are deteriorating. There are riots in the streets. Suicides are up. All of the social maladies that accompany rising unemployment, lost opportunity, and so forth. We're seeing it happen, right? From Ireland to the UK, Portugal, Greece, of course. So where are we in the US today? Well, we have the super committee. We have a plan to cut the deficit. We have 25 million Americans who want full-time work who can't find it. 25 million. Okay? The official unemployment rate is 9.1%. But the official unemployment rate underestimates the true extent of the unemployment problem because it doesn't capture all of the people who want full-time jobs and can't find them. Who's left out of those official numbers? All the people whose hours have been cut to the point that they're now part-time workers, who've lost their benefits, who really want full-time work. We have a sense of how many of those there are. Okay? There are surveys. We get the numbers. What about all the people who looked for work and looked for work and looked for work and couldn't find a job and finally gave up? We call those discouraged workers. They drop out of the labor force. They stop looking. If you stop looking, you're not unemployed. If you add the officially unemployed to the part-timers who want full-time work, to the discouraged workers who stop looking, you get a number about 25 million. What a waste. Talk about inefficiency. All that lost output. Not to mention, as a human being, not feeling like you have a purpose, not feeling like you're contributing, wanting to work, and being told by the market, we don't want you. There's nothing for you. right? 2 million of those 25 million unemployed have been unemployed for more than 99 weeks. We call those the long-term unemployed. 99 weeks of looking for a job and not finding one. Okay, youth unemployment rates are the highest as a demographic. Young people, those with no high school diploma or those with only a high school diploma, twice as likely to be unemployed as those with some college education. The more education you have, the more likely you are to find employment. Good lesson for you. Stay in school. The housing market continues to struggle, right? We're not through that yet. Homeowners are still struggling. 40% of homeowners who have a second mortgage on their home are underwater. What they owe is more than the value of the home. 20 to 25% of those with first mortgages are underwater. People are struggling to make the mortgage payment. They're struggling to stay in their home. They're struggling to find a job. Retail sales, manufacturing, new starts, we get data every month. Sometimes we get weekly data. And we look for the bright spots. Economists do, right? Pundits do. And you get a bit of good news, and you read the tea leaves, and you start to think, well, maybe this is the bottom. Maybe the recovery is taking foot. Right? And then come the next set of figures, maybe 2 o'clock that afternoon, and they don't look as good. Different set of data. Right? And then the hand-wringing begins, and the talk of the double dip begins. And so we had a survey recently that was featured in the New York Times. Asked small businesses, what's the biggest challenge you face? It wasn't regulation, it wasn't high taxes, it was sales. We don't have customers. Sales create jobs. They need customers, right? But where are those sales going to come from? Macroeconomists divide the economy into sectors. And we say there's a household sector, there's a business sector, there's a government sector, and then there's the rest of the world, the foreign sector. In the US, the household sector accounts for about 70% of total spending. When I ask my students, which sector do you think accounts for the largest share of total spending, you know what they all say? Because they watch too much TV. They all say government. They just think, everybody talks about how big they are, must be the biggest, right? No, it's the household sector. 70% of total spending comes from us, households. So if you're talking about getting the economy to recover, 70% of the total demand in the economy comes from people like us, the household sector. The problem is, we're not back yet. We're not back because we're worried. We're worried about keeping the job. We're worried about keeping the hours. The wages could be cut. The hours could be cut. My job could be eliminated. What if I can't stay in my home? What if the value of my home continues to go down? We're worried, and until we stop worrying, we're not coming back. 70% of the economy. And until we come back, there's no reason for the business sector to start investing and hiring workers. They don't have the consumers. They don't have the demand. Okay? So 70% of the economy is not back, and until they come back, businesses have no incentive to expand and hire. The foreign sector is a small percent of total spending. In the US, it's about 4% of GDP. That's not going to pull us out of where we are. It's too little. The last thing, the only thing left, much as you might not like to hear it, is government. It's the only sector left. Right? Sales create jobs. Income creates sales. Spending creates income. When the government spends, someone gets the income. Income creates sales. Sales create jobs. Okay, there's an economist by the name of Abba Lerner who inspires a lot of the work that I and my colleagues at the University of Missouri in Kansas City do. The blog is largely driven by Lerner's approach to macroeconomics. He's known for an approach that he dubbed functional finance. Functional finance. What is that? Well, it's kind of the opposite of dysfunctional finance. It's functional finance. Lerner is a really interesting character, and his pieces are a lot of fun to read, so I assign them to my students quite a bit. He also wrote a piece called The Economics of the Steering Wheel. The Economics of the Steering Wheel is this article that begins with a visit to a far-off world, another planet. And he says, imagine that you travel through space and you find yourself landing on another planet. And you get out and you look around and you notice they have this really strange highway system, this interplanetary highway system where all of the cars move through lanes. Nobody has a steering wheel. They have high curbs on the left and right. So the vehicles bounce to the left and bounce to the right, and most of the time they stay on track. He says if a few of them end up going over and you see the burned cars on the side of the road, it's a caution, he said. But for the most part, the cars stay on the road, but they bang from side to side. And he says, you would look at that coming from this planet and say, they're mad. Why would they subject themselves to a travel system that jars them about so much, that jeopardizes their well-being? He said, if you think about it, we do the same exact thing here when it comes to the economy. We allow output and employment to swing from left to right, booms and busts, booms and busts. We call them business cycles. And sometimes the upswing is quite steep, and sometimes the downturn is quite steep. And we just sort of go along for the ride, up and down we go, without a steering wheel. And so Lerner says, wouldn't it make more sense for policymakers to devise a steering wheel, to learn how to take control of your own destiny, steer the economy away from trouble, trouble being too much demand, inflation, and trouble being too little demand, unemployment. Keep the car in the middle of the path, where you avoid high levels of inflation and high levels of unemployment, and steer yourself along. How can you do that? And why don't we do that? Well, we don't do it, I think, in part because we believe that we can't afford it. The president tells us we're broke. How could you do it? You're supposed to steer the car by cutting taxes when unemployment is too high, or increasing government spending when unemployment is too high. If aggregate demand is already very high and unemployment is low, and you're worried about inflation, you cut government spending, you raise taxes. That's your steering wheel. But we think we can't afford to adjust taxes and spending to the right levels because we're broke. There is no alternative. We're afraid of becoming the next Greece. That rattled us. And maybe for some, it was politically expedient to say, if we don't start cutting now, or raising taxes now, we're going to end up like them. Okay, but for a lot of people, I think there was a genuine belief that the U.S. could end up like Greece. The public apparently agrees. You see it and hear it. TV, radio, newspapers. We're bombarded with this. And where is the side that argues against it? I don't see it very often. I write it, but I don't find it in a lot of places. So the public acquiesces. There's no alternative. How can we ask the government to do something about 25 million unemployed people? They can't afford it. They're broke. They told us. And so the government tells us we have to have shared sacrifice. And we say, okay, take what you need. Reform Social Security, cut my benefits, modify Medicare, raise the costs, cut the benefit aid, whatever you need to do. There is no alternative. We go along because we believe it's true. Obama says we have to eat our peas. We have to eat our peas. We have to. There is no alternative. We don't want to end up like Greece. But there's something really different about Greece. We won't end up like Greece. Greece made a terrible mistake. Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Spain, Germany, France, they're all in the same boat. 17 countries that gave up their sovereign currencies, currencies that they could issue, create, and control, and they adopted the euro. A common currency that none of those 17 governments can create. They are all today using the euro. They are users of the currency. It makes a world of difference. The monetary system that they put in place there is fundamentally different than the monetary system we have in place in the US. The rules of the game, as a consequence, are fundamentally different. We don't have to behave like Greece because we don't have the same constraints that Greece has. Greece can't create the euro. Ireland can't create the euro. What happened in these countries? Things seem to be all right. I mean, the euro was introduced in 1999. For a while, nearly a decade, it seemed to be working out okay. Until the very first crisis hit. And that's where the weaknesses were revealed. What happened? Global financial crisis. Economic meltdown. What happens when there's an economic meltdown? Big recession, right? People lose their jobs. When people lose their jobs, people lose their income. When income goes down, taxes go down. Anybody in the room that ever served on a city council, state legislator, any of that, you know this, right, at the state level. Taxes, income goes down, taxes go down. Income taxes, right? So the economic crisis hits, people lose their jobs, they lose their income, taxes go down, and all kinds of government spending goes up. We call them automatic stabilizers. They're supposed to help stabilize the system. We don't want to keep collecting taxes at the old level when people lose their jobs, hold taxes constant. That's not what you want, right? You'd make things worse. Tax revenues go down in a downturn, government spending goes up because when people become unemployed, they ask for unemployment compensation. That kicks in. When people lose a job, lose the health care that came with that job, they go apply for Medicaid. That kicks in. A whole host, food stamps, all of these government programs that are part of the safety net kick in automatically when the economy turns down. Your tax receipts go down, your spending goes up, leaving your deficit bigger. Okay? Ours got bigger, the UK's got bigger, countries in the Eurozone debts grew. Everybody that was affected by the downturn saw their deficits get bigger. The problem is in the Eurozone, all of these governments, because they can't create the euro, have to go to the capital markets and borrow. Greece has to sell Greek paper. Ireland has to sell bonds issued by the Irish government. Germany gets to sell German bonds, right? the best of the best, the safest of the 17, the benchmark issuer, right? So Germany can borrow on better terms, lower interest rates. Markets are more comfortable with Germany's ability to repay. They look at a country like Greece and Ireland and they say, I don't know. We're lending to Germany at 4%. How about 5.25% for you? Yields are different. Different countries have to pay a premium for the perception that they're more risky. So Greece borrows and they pay the premium, and the economy doesn't improve and the deficit widens and they have to go back and ask for more. And financial markets say, I don't know, that debt's getting awful big. How about 6%? Okay, so they borrow at 6%. And then the governments get involved, the EU gets involved, the IMF gets involved, the European Central Bank gets involved, and they say, listen, let's talk bailout because your debt is getting so big and financial markets are raising rates. It looks increasingly likely that you might default. Let's work out a deal. We'll help you lower the rates. We'll lend to you on better terms. In exchange for that, you're going to cut your deficit. This is what you read about fiscal austerity. I mean, huge cuts. We want this 14% of GDP deficit down to 7% in 3 years. How are you going to do it? They have whacked the heck out of the Greek people. Taxes, property taxes, income taxes. This is how you try to cut the deficit, right? Raise taxes and cut spending. Lay off employees, cut, raise taxes, and what's happening? Well, not to my surprise, but things are getting worse. They're getting worse, right? So the Greek situation is quite dire. The US draws all of the wrong lessons from what's happened in the Eurozone. We better get our fiscal house in order quick before we end up like these guys, right? And so we allow 25 million Americans to sit idle, produce nothing of value for the market, right? Draw unemployment. We actually pay them to remain idle. Unemployment compensation. Then we have to have a fight on the Hill every few months because unemployment benefits are about to expire, and you have to wrangle with the other side to get an extension because otherwise their income goes from $325 a month to $0. Then they can't even buy what little they were buying, right? So we have the capacity to use a steering wheel, but we choose not to use it because we believe that there is no alternative. We don't understand our own monetary system. The United States government is not the user of the dollar. It is the issuer of the dollar. It is the sole issuer of the US dollar. The US government does not need to come to you and to me to get the dollar. We got it from them in the first place. It's the only place it could have come from. They are the source of our nation's currency. They are not users. You and I are the users of the currency. Businesses are users. Local governments, state governments, they are users of the currency, right? The Iowa budget may be in deficit. You may have a budget problem. The state of Iowa cannot make that go away with a keystroke. The federal government can spend by crediting bank accounts. In fact, that's the way the US government makes all of its purchases. Ben Bernanke was asked in an interview on television, well, that's an awful lot of money you've spent trying to bail out foreign central banks and bail out domestic banks in the US, and there were the auto bailouts, and where's all this money coming from? Is that taxpayer money? That was the question. Is that taxpayer money? And Bernanke didn't skip a beat. Very candid, very honest. He said, it's not taxpayer money. He said, all of the banks have accounts with us. So when we want to spend, we just credit their account. Keystrokes. The US government is the issuer of the currency. It cannot run out of keystrokes. Do you go to the bowling alley with your friends and start a game, and you're having a great game, I mean strike after strike, and you say to your buddy, I hope the bowling alley's got enough points to put up because I'm afraid that they're going to run out here. No, you don't. The government is the scorekeeper. It can't run out of points. It spends by crediting bank accounts. Okay? So what we have in the US today is a government with a fiscal policy that serves basically as an imperfect shock absorber. We don't take full advantage of the economic steering wheel, but we have some shock absorbers in place. Those are the automatic stabilizers. We have things that kick in automatically when the economy turns down. Different types of payments increase to provide people with some source of income so their income doesn't go to zero. Right? We allow taxes to decline when incomes decline. That's a form of an automatic stabilizer. It's a shock absorber. Market economies cycle. Every single one on the planet cycles. I mean, it goes through ups and downs, has business cycles. There's not a one that doesn't. How wide do you want to allow the cycle to get? How big do you want to allow the swings to get? In the downturn, unemployment goes up. Do you want to let the downturn continue unabated, or do you want to step in with some kind of a policy response and bring about the recovery sooner? I do. I want the shock absorbers to be effective, and I want them to be permanent. And what we have is a semi-permanent, semi-effective shock absorber. Because when the unemployment compensation expires, we have to fight about whether to extend it. It's not automatic, right? When the Medicaid funding is about to dry up, we have to fight for additional funds and so forth. There's a handout that I created. Economists like data and graphs, so I had to do at least one of these. But this is really useful in terms of illustrating the point, because the topic for tonight was why you and I can't spend more than we make, but the government can and probably should. So this graph, if you have it, and if you don't, I think there are plenty of copies around. This is a graph that takes the government sector and the private sector and splits them apart. The blue line is the private sector. The red line is the public sector, government. Both lines show the financial balance in the respective sectors. So think about it as you look at the graph. Think about the argument that you hear that when the private sector tightens its belt, the public sector should too. Okay, when the private sector tightens its belt, that means the blue line goes up. That's the private sector's surplus. The blue line goes up. What do you notice about the behavior of the red line compared to the line? Do they move together up and down? What do? They move in inverse, opposite, mirror image, diametrically opposed manner. When we go up, they go down. Do you think there's a reason for that? What is a government deficit? The red line is the public sector balance. So notice here's zero. Anything above zero is a surplus. Anything below zero is a deficit. Who is almost always in surplus? The private sector. Who is almost always in deficit? The public sector. I didn't make up the data. This is exactly the way it works. When the government runs a deficit, what does it mean? We hear the word deficit, there's almost a visceral reaction from some folks. Deficit is a pejorative, it's, right? I mean, you must be doing something wrong if you're running a deficit. It's irresponsible. What are you doing? Deficit means spending more than you take in, spending more than you're collecting. If we have two sectors, public and private, and the public sector spends more than it takes from us, it means we are being left with what? The difference, the surplus. Every one of these government deficits, every one has a corresponding private sector surplus. Look what's happened in the recent year and a half, 2 years. The government's deficit has gone, budget position has gone massively into deficit, and the private sector's budget position has gone massively into surplus. Massively into surplus. This is exactly what we want. We have a private sector that took on too much debt. The debt-to-income ratios got too high. We are trying, as a private sector, to de-leverage. We are trying to pay down our debt, to build back up some savings. That deficit is allowing us to do that. Their deficit is our surplus. It cannot work any other way. It is the rule of balance sheet accounting. I think one man's surplus is another man's deficit. One man's asset is another man's liability. It works that way. So those who say the federal government should balance its budget should revisit the Clinton years, because that's the most recent example of a balanced budget. In fact, a surplus. You see where the red line crosses the horizontal axis at 0, the federal government's budget moves into surplus. And what happened to the poor private sector? Unprecedented deficits. Look at that. Big decline in private sector balance sheets. That's a marked deterioration in the private sector's budget position. It was unsustainable. It was destined to end. But at the time, very few people said that. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office that does all the scoring and so forth, the CBO looked at the federal government's budget during Clinton's administration and said, the US government is projected to run surpluses as far as the eye can see. Really? And a few of us said, it's not going to happen. It's impossible. The private sector cannot sustain for any long period of time a deficit position. They can't pay out more than they take in, but guess who can? Public sector. If they control their own currency. If they control their own currency. So we could devise stronger shock absorbers. We could do more for the 25 million who remain unemployed. We could create a more perfect macroeconomic response to these downturns in the economy. We could institute a job guarantee program. Everybody talks about job creation, but what do they propose? Indirect job creation. Everything is always indirect. The last proposal that we got from this administration was a $447 billion package of tax cuts and increased government spending. A mini stimulus package, right? The $787 billion that we got 2.5 years ago, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, we call it the Stimulus Act, right? It's just a smaller version of that. 60% of what's in the President's Jobs Act are incentives, tax cuts. 60%. I don't oppose tax cuts. I think we should be cutting taxes. But you can't rely on tax cuts aimed at the business sector to stimulate output, employment, and hiring. Why? It's a carrot. So you dangle the carrot out there and you say to businesses, hire some returning veterans and we will compensate you in the form of a tax break. Hire some of the long-term unemployed and we will compensate you in the form of a tax break. Go buy some new capital equipment and we will allow you to depreciate that piece of capital in 1 year, accelerated depreciation. It's an incentive. It allows them to write off all the depreciation, reduce their tax liability. Carrot, 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 incentive, incentive. This is what they tried for the last 2.5 years. But businesses are telling you, the survey was in the Times 2 weeks ago. They need customers. Sales are what's holding them back. The number one thing holding them back, they say, sales. We need sales. So we need people with income to spend, and we need to create some jobs. And we need to do it, I think, directly. And the way that I like, one of the things that I would advocate is an employer of last resort for a job guarantee program. Something modeled on the New Deal program, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, the National Youth Administration, the NYA. Remember, youth unemployment, highest unemployment demographic in the US right now. We need bold, imaginative programs to deal with the structural unemployment that we have, and there is no dearth of work to do. President Obama says we have people who've lost manufacturing jobs, we have people who've lost construction jobs. We need infrastructure. Put them together. I say yes. The Civilian Corps of Engineers tells us that we have a $2.3 trillion infrastructure deficit in this country. $2.3 trillion. Do you know how much of the $447 billion Jobs Act includes infrastructure spending? $50 billion. $50 billion. We have a $2.3 trillion deficit. We're a lot of zeros away from coming close to putting a dent in that. Okay, so there are a lot of things that we could do. Aid to state and local governments. States need another round of aid. They need a revenue distribution on a per capita basis to help with the ongoing budget shortfalls. They ought to take care of that as well, because as long as the left hand is trying to stimulate at the federal level and the right hand is pulling it away at the state and local level, you never gain ground. Okay, so we have to help states as well. The payroll tax cut was smart. The first payroll tax cut was a 2% reduction. I think I got another $40-some a month in my paycheck. That's not much, but I spend it. Right? We were proposing almost 2.5 years ago a full payroll tax holiday, not just for the worker, but for the employer too. If he had done these three things, a full payroll tax holiday, revenue sharing for the states, and a job guarantee, I don't think I would have been invited here tonight, because I wouldn't have started the blog. Things would have improved quickly. But we don't do it because we're broke and there is no alternative to these cuts. And until people begin to understand that the US is different, Canada, the UK, Australia, the US, we are sovereign issuers of our currency. We control our own currency. That permits a degree of flexibility in terms of the policy response that these other nations in Europe don't have. And we don't have to behave like them. Okay, we were smarter. We didn't do what they did. We should act smarter. There is an alternative, but until we get rid of the myth of Tina, we're never going to get